For those of you brand new to POP, we are a nonprofit that plants and supports community orchards in the city. We're celebrating our 15th year this year and currently support 66 orchard sites in the city of Philadelphia. We'll be doing sort of a whirlwind tour of key orchard tasks. And then following basics of orchard care, we'll be focusing tonight on pruning, which of course is the key task this time of year. We'll be going through tools, terminology, how to prune fruit trees. We'll have another question and answer, and then we'll move on to berry bushes, brambles, and fruiting vines. And we'll also at the end make sure we share, I think we can do it now as well, share our resources page, which also went out in the email reminder, but it's a whole sheet of links to more information, including our pruning video series and a lot of other content. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon to kick us off.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So we're going to get started. Up on the screen here, we have our POP monthly orchard task list. So this is a great resource that we have provided on the Philly Orchard website and on our resource page. So essentially, this is a month-by-month breakdown of what needs to be done in the orchard. Great if you are just starting out with new fruit trees, or if you've been doing this for a long time and you just need a refresher. This is a great guide to have that we will have available on our resource page. But for the sake of time, we're just going to be going through the orchard task list season by season. Next slide. So for the winter, between November and December, we want to protect and wrap our figs and our pomegranate trees, which I'll talk a little bit more in depth in the next slide. During the winter, as Phil said, January through March, we are doing pruning. So we're pruning our fruit and nut trees, berry bushes, brambles, and vines. For pest and disease management, while you're pruning, you want to remove any mummified fruit. And this primarily will be on your pome and your stone fruits, since any fruit left hanging can be a potential source for disease spores. And then February through March, right before the bud break, you want to apply a dormant oil spray for control of aphids, scale mites, and their eggs, which we'll talk more about next Tuesday during POPCORE 2 pest and disease management. Next slide. So I mentioned really briefly protecting your figs and your pomegranate trees, and I just wanted to talk a little more in depth about it. So these are cold sensitive trees. Anything colder than 20 degrees Fahrenheit can cause injury to the tree, so they do benefit from winter protection. So for younger trees, you can tie the branches closely together, put fencing around it, and then fill them with leaves for insulation. For older, much larger trees, you can actually cover bigger branches with row fabric, bed sheets, and any type of insulation. Next slide. Continuing on with our winter task list, this is a great time to do orchard tool maintenance. So before you get started with pruning, you want to make sure that your tools are clean, sharp, and they're repaired and they're ready to go. Also, evaluate all your tools for the season and decide what you'll be needing for the upcoming season. So this is a great time to order your gloves, your harvest equipment, and most importantly, your sprays and your pest management supplies. And then during this time of the year, November through December, you can do some harvesting, usually persimmons, medlars, hawthorns, and ginkgos. All right. So next slide. So I'm going to pass it over to Corey, who's going to talk more in depth about spring task lists.
Good evening, everybody. So when we think spring, we think a time of enormous growth and just a lot of energy taken up by the plants for everything. So first and foremost, we apply compost, fertilizer, compost tea, nutrition in some sort of way to our orchard. We want to do a thorough weeding and mulching. And then the other thing that's high on our minds is monitoring for pests and disease. And so that should look like a weekly walkthrough to scout for any signs of anything that we'll talk about next Tuesday, and to make any notes. There should be a weekly walkthrough with your pest and disease guide. And so the spring weeding and mulching, I think this would look like a big work day for your springtime. You want to get that nutrition in. So I think the best way to go about it is to weed out around all of your fruit trees, at least 3 feet out, apply that compost, and then put that 3 inches of wood chips right on top of that. And you'll be setting yourself up for success. You also can then unwrap those figs and pomegranates that you wrapped in the winter. We often put off pruning our figs till later on. People are always excited to prune the figs. And they can kind of take it any time of year because they have so little disease and pest pressure. But we like to put off pruning because there's what we call winter kill with figs. They're a Mediterranean crop. And when it drops less than 17 degrees, the branches will freeze and die. And so we wait until March, April, when there's no chance of a killing from that freezing temperature anymore, to see what we have left, cut off the dead first, and then go from there. Okay, so spring is also for planting trees, berries, vines, herbs, thinning your fruit, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second. Emergency pruning, getting out that dead, diseased, damaged, and root suckers, which we're also going to talk about more later. And then you're harvesting. You're starting to get a little bit of excitement. You got rhubarb, perennial greens, asparagus, strawberries, gummies, Juneberries. So spring planting, exciting time in the orchard. We often say that fall planting is preferred because it is less dependent on us being very consistent. When we plant in the spring, it gets hot quickly, and we need to make sure that we're really on top of watering, or we could lose our plantings. So that should look, for the first 6 weeks, like you're watering twice a week, a total of an inch of water a week, either by rain or by irrigation. A nice little trick is a 5-gallon bucket per tree a week is that inch, or watch the weather. And then after 6 weeks, you could take it down to once a week. But yeah, watering should be main on your mind in the spring. And then the fruit thinning. This is a big test too. This is good for a work day. It takes a lot of time. And if your trees are really young, if you're in your first or second season, you need to remove all of the fruit off of the trees. It could be really tempting to let yourself have 1 or 2 or 3 nice good ones to reward yourself for the year, but it takes a lot of energy to produce fruit, and you want to create that structure of the tree before you hang fruit on it. So take off all the fruit for the first 2 seasons. And then for apples, Asian pears and European pears, you're going to thin down to 5 inches apart. You want to keep the biggest, healthiest looking ones. When you're thinning, this could be a time for thinning out things that have been affected by pests already, maybe plum cucurlio you see on there, you can thin those out. Peaches, you're going to take down to 8 inches, though you can fudge this a little bit closer if you have, especially if you have a heavy squirrel pressure, they're going to thin some of that out for you. And then the smaller fruits, plums, apricots, you're going to go down to 4 inches. Okay, and then once we're hitting summer, we're doing a lot of the same things. We're weeding, we're mulching, we're making sure all of our plantings are getting watered. We're looking out for that emergency pruning, any dead, diseased, or damaged branches we want to get out of there. And then we're continuing with that weekly monitoring, the walkthrough, taking pictures of anything that looks off to keep track of things. Without record keeping, it's really hard to treat pests and diseases. So the more records you can create, any notes and pictures is really good trail for you to be able to manage things throughout the season. And then you want to remove branch spreaders. We're going to talk about branch spreaders a little bit later, but we use them as a training tool. We stick them into the tree and they train the tree out. But if we forget to take them off, the tree kind of swallows them up. So you need to remember to take those off midsummer. And then we do our summer bramble pruning, blackberries, raspberries. So that's a nice task for the summer. And then, of course, lots and lots of harvest, berries and stone fruit especially. And now I'm going to pass it back to Sharon.
All right. So in the fall, you want to continue your weeding and your mulching, and also continue the weekly waterings of new plantings. For any pruning, as Corey was mentioning, you want to keep it limited to emergency pruning only. So pruning out the dead, diseased, and damaged branches. For pest and disease management, you can continue using any holistic or organic sprays for whatever specific to your orchard. And you can also do cardboard banding for coddling moth during this time, which we'll go over more during POPCORE 2. During this time, you want to remove dropped and diseased fruit and gather and dispose any traps and mating disruptors. Fall, you can do some plantings. This is ideal time for plantings. So planting trees, shrubs, vines, herbaceous perennials, but you want to avoid planting cold sensitive plants or evergreens. Phil's going to talk more about fall leaf management. That's usually happening during this time of the year. And fall is a huge time for harvest all over the city. You'll be seeing apples, figs, Asian pears, the highly coveted pawpaw, jujubes, nuts, pomegranates, which you can grow in the city, and herbs, and a lot more. There are plenty of harvest festivals happening, as well as the Philadelphia Orchard Week. So as the fall season is winding down, this is a great time to update your records from the season. So your harvest data, any pest and disease management notes, and any new plantings that you did. So as Corey was talking about before, fall is a great time to do planting. Planting in the fall gives the plants a head start on growth for the following spring. And the cooler weather causes less stress on new plants. So this allows the roots to establish before the winter. All right, next slide. And here we have some folks celebrating the harvest. To the left, we have our cider press, which typically takes a tour around the city. It's great to put in all the different apples and try fresh cider. And to the right here, we have a very abundant strawberry harvest happening. All right. And Phil here is going to talk more on fall leaf management.
Hey folks, so just another important fall task is to think about what you do with your leaves after they drop. And the important thing to understand is that they're often a vector for disease on the common fruits. So as the leaves drop, there are often disease spores, different kinds on the leaves. And if they are left in the orchard until the spring, they can reinfect the tree again the next season. So you need to have some strategy for your leaf drop. And there's a few options in commercial orchards. They are very sanitary. They just remove everything from the site to avoid that risk. We prefer a more ecological approach, which is to let the leaves drop and then help them decompose in place. You can do that by, after most leaves have dropped, put a layer of compost under your trees, inch or so, or even better, apply a compost tea, which we'll talk more about next week. But these are strategies to speed up the decomposition process on your leaves and break them down so that there aren't pathogens to reinfect the tree the next season. So just a little bit about that. Of course, you can also gather the leaves for other purposes, like we showed you wrapping your figs in winter. We often, at least with young figs, do that with fencing and your fall leaves as insulation. Next slide. And yeah, just to mention again, orchard season wrap up. So we do, you can find all kinds of resources on our website and on that resources page we shared out, including the harvest tracking sheet. So this is a great way to record your harvest and know, be able to compare from year to year how much you're getting. So be aware of that as a resource, as well as Sharon mentioned, a great time to also record what happened with pests and disease so that you can come up with a strategy for the next year. And I believe that wraps up these slides. We have a little time for question and answer on this sort of first intro section. I was monitoring the chat a bit, and I think we answered many of the questions there, but one question I saw was on the fruit thinning, what the different distances in between, what that meant, the number of inches, and that is the distance between the fruitlets you're going to leave. So in many cases, you're actually removing most of the little fruit from your tree throughout its life. As Corey explained, in the first couple of years, you remove all of it, but for those plants listed, every year throughout their life, it's good to thin the fruit to that distance indicated. So apples 5 inches apart, peaches up to 8 inches apart, which means you're removing 90% of the little fruitlets in late spring. Was there any other questions, Simone or Kim, that didn't get answered or would be good to address?
Someone asked if we would be posting the slides after.
Yeah, I think we can do that. Last year we did repost the recordings to everyone, but I think we could also do like a PDF of the slides. I don't see any reason we can do that too. Anything else, or should we move on to pruning?
Someone asked how they could get involved with an orchard. Would they email you for that?
That would be the easiest first step. We have various ways to get involved, the Lead Orchard Volunteer Program, but if you email us, we can give you more information on that. This is a time of year when we are actively recruiting Lead Orchard volunteers. So I believe, Sharon, you're kicking off pruning. Is that next?
Yep, sounds right. All right, so before you prune, you need to make sure you have all the tools you need. First and foremost, you need bypass hand pruners. So these kind of work like scissors. They give you sharp, precise cuts. You want to avoid anvil pruners. And also when you're buying pruners, you want to really consider the quality. That way you have, tools that will last you throughout the seasons. We recommend brands such as Felco, Corona, and my personal favorite is ARS. You also need to have a handsaw for older, thicker branch cuts. It's great to have a pole pruner, a pair of loppers for berries and bramble, and a pole saw for higher cuts on a tree. So I saw someone had asked about how you sharpen your tools. You use a blade sharpener. Corona actually offers this tool. It will provide sharpening for loppers, hand pruners, and pole pruners. This is just really important to have. That way you can make sure that you're getting sharp, precise cuts. Very important to have sanitizing spray on you for all prunings. So something to consider is if you're not sanitizing, you can unknowingly spread diseases between trees. So we typically like to sanitize all our tools before pruning and in between pruning different trees. We recommend using a 70% or 91% isopropyl alcohol solution. You can find this usually at a dollar store, CVS, or any convenience store. And we have an orchard ladder. These are great because they're lightweight. The more narrow construction allows you to get closer to the tree and position it precisely. And it's more of a tri-fold So this is great to have, especially if you have taller trees. You can get close to the tree to make great cuts. All right, and I believe Corey is going to take over and start us off with fruit tree pruning terminology.
Yes. All right. So we're gonna dig into some terminology so we can get a little deeper into things. And first, we categorize the fruits in 3 different categories, and it's helpful to think about things in categories because then you start to be able to group like, oh, this pome fruits have this sort of growth habit, and I prune them to this sort of tree form. And they have these sort of disease issues. So pome fruits are the ones with those small clusters of seeds in the middle, think apples, pears, quince. And stone fruit are the ones with the pits, the peaches, the plums, the nectarines, the sprawling growth habit, and then the unusual fruits, which for us were figs, think pomegranates, persimmons, and for us, they're usually have very little pest and disease issue, and some of them don't even need pruned, which are making them our highest yielding crops, tree crops, pawpaws, highest yielding. The unusuals are doing really well for us. And then when we're talking about the structure of the tree, we have some terms to learn. So the central trunk, we call that the central leader. When we're talking about the tree form, that central leader, and then coming off of that, the branches we called scaffolds. So off of a central leader, I want to have 4 scaffolds, 4 branches coming in different directions, 4 different directions, and branches in one area, I'm going to call that a tier. And then I want to have a skip, no branches, and another tier. So we have central leader, scaffolds, tiers. And then when we're thinking about fruit tree propagation, it's mostly not happening through sexual propagation, seed propagation, it's happening through grafting. So for fruit trees, the rootstock is what provides the size of the tree. There's dwarfing, semi-dwarfing, full different rootstock, and then it also provides the disease resistance. And the scion is what is the fruiting wood. It's a 1-year-old piece of wood with only veg buds on it, and it's grafted to the rootstock, and that is what provides whatever fruit it will be. And then the graft union is where those 2 things connect. And right here in this picture, it's very obvious where it becomes bulbous and then narrows in. That is where the graft union is. It's not always that obvious, but that is that. And then we have suckers, root suckers, you could call them, and water sprouts. So root suckers are coming up from the root of the tree below the graft union, and you always want to cut them down as far as you can whenever you see them. They're just sucking off energy that isn't going to ever produce you fruit. And then water sprouts are also this very vertical vegetative growth that often happens on older wood. And it can be the result of too heavy of a pruning, and then you're kind of directing energy when you're pruning. And if there's nowhere for that energy to go, you cut off too much, it just vegetative growth is going to spring up in the middle of a limb, and we call them water sprouts. Alternate bearing is the natural tendency for fruit trees to bear heavy in one year and then really light in the next. And so this is, you can see this the most if you're not pruning a tree, you're not thinning a tree. It kind of have these cycles of heavy and then light, maybe 2 light years and then heavy again. But we even out those cycles with pruning and thinning our fruits. Okay, so now we're going to get a little bit to why do we prune at all? It's a lot of work. It's cold outside. We do it for many good reasons. The first one is to prevent infection and spread of diseases. In our hot, humid climates, it's a perfect breeding ground for a lot of diseases. They like that moist environment. And so by opening up the tree to sunlight and airflow, we're making it a less hospitable environment. We're drying out those afternoon rains, that humidity with the airflow and sunlight. So that's a main reason. We're doing it to create a good structure. So we've bred our fruit trees to have heavier and heavier fruit. And with the weight of the wood and the weight of fruit over time, we can risk our branches snapping. So we want to have really good crotch angles, which we'll talk about in a second, and make sure we have good structure to hold the weight of all of this great fruit. Then we do it for quality, quantity, and consistency of harvest. That's kind of echoing back to that alternate bearing tendency. And then we do it to stimulate and direct the growth. So we want to understand what we're doing because the tree reacts to how we prune it. It's a direct conversation happening back and forth. And so we do it to get it to grow in the ways that we want it to grow. And then we do it to control the size. We can stimulate the growth or we can bring it back down. And then why do we do it in winter when it's cold and uncomfortable outside? And we all wish there was better wool socks. Well, we do it first because it's easier to see the structure of the tree without the leaves. You can really see what's going on. You can dig deep into the form. Second, we do it because the trees are dormant, but so are the pests and diseases. And as we're opening up these trees, we're cutting them, creating open wound sites where pests and disease could come in. It becomes a vulnerable spot, but there's less risk because the pests and disease are also dormant. And along with that, winter is the season right before spring when a lot of growth happens and those wounds that we created can heal over quickly. So it's all about decreasing the risk of pests and disease. And I think here I'm gonna pass it off to Sharon to talk about growth habits.
Yeah. So growth habit is the natural shape of a tree that determines the form that we prune it. So we have 3 different tree forms. The first is the central leader form. So this is primarily seen in apple trees, pear trees, and European plums. It most closely resembles a Christmas tree shape. So with this form, we have a central leader, and it has 3 tiers of scaffolding branches, evenly spaced around the tree. The first tier is about 2 to 3 feet, so think about waist height. The second tier is about 5 to 6 feet, so think on average about head height. And your last tier of branches are going to be as high as you can reach, so 8+ feet. This form allows light to enter in through the sides of the tree. Next. So next we have an open center form, and you'll see this form commonly with peach trees, Asian plum trees, pie cherries, and apricots. So this is like a vase-shaped tree. You have 2 to 3 feet of trunk that opens up to the scaffolding branches, and they come off the trunk at a 45 to 60 degree angle. This form, unlike the central leader, allows light to enter in from the top. And lastly, we have our modified central leader. So this combines the central leader with the open center form. The scaffolding branches, rather than being in tiers, they kind of spiral, and then at about 5 to 8 feet, they open up into an open center form. You'll primarily see apples, pears, sweet cherries, and persimmons in this type of form. All right. And here we have an illustration of our different tree forms. So you can think of the open center as like an upside down cone. Your central leader has that classic kind of Christmas tree shape there. And then the modified central has those scaffolding branches spiraling up, and then at about 5 to 8 feet, opening up into that central open center form. All right, and I believe I'm passing it back to Corey, who's going to talk more about our fruit tree pruning terminology.
Yes. Okay, so you're thinking about what fruit tree you have in your orchard, its natural growth habit, how you pair that with kind of the tree form, which is your cheat sheet of how to get all the air and light penetration in there. And now we're going to hit you with a little bit more terminology. So the crotch angle, I want that strong structure of the tree. The angles we want going from the central leader off to the scaffolds is 45 to 60 degrees. That's what's the strongest. Any narrower or wider, it gets weak when things get heavy and windy and filled with snow. And then limb spreading, I touched on this slightly before. When trees are younger, the young vegetative growth, it's usually pretty vertical and it's pretty flexible. And so when we're training a tree, we want to train it to be more horizontal. Vertical wood is vegetative in growth. Horizontal wood is more leaning towards fruiting, and we always want our wood to be fruiting. So we can push it out when it's young with a training tool. They come in all different looks. They're plastic, wood, metal. I saw Phil use a toothpick last week because that very pliable young wood. So you just very carefully take a branch from a more vertical position and you push it out. And then with a spreader, you put tension between the two. And over a couple of months, it'll firm up and you can remove that in summer. And then we have 3 different types of buds on a fruit tree. We have veg buds, fruit buds, and terminal buds. The vegetative buds for most fruit trees is gonna, all of first year wood that grew last year are gonna be veg buds. Those buds become leaves or branch with leaves. They never become a fruit. Except for peaches, they have their fruit buds on first year wood. So fruit buds in the spring unfurl into a flower. If they get pollinated and everything goes right, they will become the fruit. They're usually on second year and older wood, but that varies from type of tree to type of tree. And this is also very important to know for when you're making a cut. If I make a pruning cut to a veg bud, it's going to cause it to grow. If I cut to a fruit bud, then that's not going to cause it to grow because there's just a fruit there. So they do different things. And then terminal buds are buds at the end of a branch, and they hold a special position because they create auxin, a hormone called auxin within their cells, and that auxin travels via gravity down and suppresses any growth below it. And so there's little side branching. But when you cut off the terminal bud, that suppressing hormone is also cut off, and you often get side branching, which is something that we really want. Side branching is where the fruit buds live. So it could be helpful when you're looking at your fruit tree to kind of like trace time backwards. This first year wood will be full of only veg buds. It will usually have more of a cinnamon color, a little reddish to it. And I forgot to mention the veg buds are slender, they're pointed, they're smaller, tightly clasped to the branch. The fruit buds are more round and plump and set away from the branch. That can be a good way to tell the difference. So first year wood is just going to be veg buds except for your peach trees. And then you'll either see a pruning wound from last year or a tight series of rings that can demarcate the between years growth. On second year wood, I should see some fruit buds, maybe a little bit of side branching, and you can kind of trace it on back, and that can be really helpful to understand how trees growth works over time. So pruning priorities, the dead, diseased, and damaged is what Pop says. Some people say disoriented. So dead, diseased, and damaged, if the branch is dead or if it's broken, that's really inviting for pests and disease to enter in it. It's a weak spot, it's vulnerable. You want to cut it out any time of year that you see it. You're going to make a thinning cut, which we're going to talk about in a second. Also, if you see disease, if you are sure of what you're seeing, you should cut it out. If you're just seeing a little gummosis and you're not sure why, maybe you shouldn't, but stay tuned next week. We'll kind of get into the nitty gritty of that. And then disoriented, we like to think of as those root suckers and those water sprouts. You could cut those out. And then for the rest of the tree, the crossing, competing, and crowding, we call it the 3 C's. So when I'm approaching a tree, I'm thinking about what kind of tree is it? What tree form am I going for? I make my big cuts first to try to get it into that tree form, make sure I'm making my scaffolds clear, clearing out that bowl of the open center. And then I'm dealing with crossing, competing, and crowding. I don't want any branches growing back towards the center. I don't want any branches rubbing up against each other. That means they don't have enough space. I need to thin some of them out. Competing branches that are like growing right on top of each other, maybe a foot or two, big branches. Only one of those branches is gonna get all the sunlight, and it's the top one. So you just choose one and take the other one out. And crowding, this third picture on the right, there's just way too many branches. There's not enough airflow and sunlight getting in there. So I gotta thin out some of those branches. So I'm saying thinning and heading. These are our two types of pruning cuts that we make. Heading cuts, we could see on the left here, is when I cut into first year wood back to a veg bud. And the result of this cut is stimulating. I'm stimulating the branch to grow in a certain direction. And that is in the direction that the bud behind the cut is pointing. It's amazing. These things are little arrows. They're pointing in the direction they're going to grow. So if I want a branch to grow, I give it a heading cut. You can just across the board, you could say 30% of last year's growth is a pretty decent heading cut to make, maybe by default, but the harder that you cut, the stronger the growth response. And it's not just only going to respond in length, it's also going to get thicker. The branch will get wider and thicker and stronger. And it will also induce side branching because it's going to cut off that terminal bud and the auxin in it. And it will also produce fruit buds. So a lot of great things happen with heading cuts. But then we have thinning cuts, which are most of the cuts that you're actually going to be making when you're pruning. And thinning cuts completely remove a branch. You either go, as in this picture, all the way back to the branch color, you take out this whole scaffold, or you go back to a smaller side branch that's also a thinning cut. So, but you're cutting back into second year or older wood. So thinning cuts, heading cuts. For your heading cuts, it's kind of a Goldilocks situation, not too far, not too close, just right. Too far, and again, you're going to get deadwood. If it's too far away, that's going to become deadwood, this little chunk right here, which is invited to pests and diseases. Too close, and you could injure the bud, and that could be bad. So you just want about 1/8 of an inch above the bud. You wanted it angled away from the bud, so as water comes through, it doesn't rot your bud, but it goes nicely away. And then how to make a thinning cut. So you want to cut right outside the branch collar, which you can often tell because there's a series of rings, kind of like how you can tell the difference between years of growth on a tree. There'll be kind of tight rings at the branch collar, and you want to cut right outside of that, like the C to D cut. That's a great cut. I don't want to make this C to, is it, I can't see, but I think it's X right there. That's cutting into the branch collar, which is going to make it harder to heal over. It's going to be more vulnerable for pest and disease to penetrate for longer. And it's also just a longer cut. It's nice to keep them short. A smaller wound is a better wound. And then if you're making a big branch, if you're removing a whole big heavy scaffold, we use a 3-cut method. If you try to do it all at once, it could be so heavy that it rips at the end, and we want to avoid that. So right here on the left, we see A. This A is a little notch, an undercut. And then a little further out from that, you're going to go above, you're going to cut it all the way down. And if the weight catches and rips away from you, it should stop right at that undercut. So you're kind of protecting yourself. So you cut that all the way off, and then you go ahead and make the thinning cut from C to D right outside the branch collar without having to worry about the weight of that whole scaffold. So these are just some pictures of some nice thinning cuts made right outside the branch collar. You can kind of see it wrinkles up right there, and the cut is right outside of that. And here they have healed over on the left. it has healed nicely all the way around the cut, and on the right, they cut a little bit into the branch collar. And so it's going to have a much harder and longer time to completely heal over there. And here are Simone's beautiful drawings of pruning over time. And so you see this first year, I'm making my thinning cuts to create the structure of this tree. This looks like, to me, it's going to be a central leader. It's kind of spiraling up its branches, and then lots of little heading cuts to stimulate growth. The second year, because of those heading cuts, we have some side branches. We have some nice structure here. You see, we've thinned out this crossing branch down here. Just nicely seeing over time what pruning looks like. And here's an example of a crowded branch, kind of before and after. And afterward, we're down to this. I think I didn't mention that we want to keep our pruning to never more than 30% of all of the mass of the tree should be taken at once. If you have a tree that hasn't been pruned in a long time, you're not going to be able to get it all the way back in 1 year. It's going to take a couple of years to get it back. So 30% is a key number, except for those peaches. They have their own rule, 50%. And now I think Phil is going to kind of talk us through a time-lapse pruning of a nectarine here.
So really the only way to learn pruning is to do it and to see it done. You can listen to this workshop and you're still going to have to go out and practice and see what your cuts do over time. But we find, hopefully this video will work, but it's helpful to see sort of the process. So this is a peach or nectarine tree, which means it does get pruned a little heavier. I don't know if this is working for folks on my screen. It's very jumpy, but anyway, you'll get to see it kind of beginning to end. Please don't climb trees like we're doing. Use an orchard ladder for a tall tree, or use a pole pruner. But anyway, you'll see the sort of overcrowded start it gets, and removing a lot of upright and inward growth to create our nice open center for the peach tree. There's the orchard ladder. And it looks like we're wrapping up. Anyway, that was a little more stop motion than it was supposed to be, but at least for me, gives you an idea of beginning to end what a tree pruning looks like. So I'm going to talk a little bit about emergency pruning. So what pruning do we do outside of the winter season? And we, in this climate, really try to keep that to a minimum because of all the pest and disease challenges we get in our humid climate. So as much as possible, we're just limiting non-winter pruning to the 3 Ds: dead, diseased, and damaged is ours, but we can also prune out root suckers and potentially water sprouts in some situations out of winter. But I've got a slide for some of these diseases you want to look out for that really need to be removed as soon as possible. And you know, the sort of secondary season for pruning is late spring, early summer, after the big flush of spring growth has happened. That is a great time to remove root suckers, but also you may in some situations consider removing some of the quick upright growth from trees, because you get a lot of less regrowth at that point in the season. We tend to avoid that mainly because we're concerned about pest and disease during in-growth season pruning. But again, really want to emphasize the importance of sanitizing your tools for pruning outside of winter. You can really spray between each cut, especially if you have a tree you know is diseased. You really need to sanitize your tools very consistently in order to avoid spread of disease. And here we are, we got some photos of some of those diseases you really need to keep an eye out for during the growing season and prune them out completely. And we'll talk more about these next week, but just pointing these out. So on the left side, that's fire blight affecting a pear tree. And it affects, you can see it here affecting fruit, but commonly starting with the tips of branches and also flowering points. And it will spread. It'll look kind of like the tree has been singed by fire. You may see a crooked end of the branch as well. But anyway, you need to prune at ideally 6 to 12 inches below where you see any sign of it. Otherwise, it'll continue to spread. We've seen it kill whole trees in a single season if left unchecked. So it is something that you should prune out any time of year that you see it. On the right side, on the upper part, you're looking at a canker, which can be, there's multiple types of cankers. It's kind of what it sounds like, a cancer on the tree, but they can be caused by fungi or bacteria. And those you want to generally prune out in hotter, drier conditions, either removing the limb that they're on, or if they haven't spread too far, you can cut the thing out of an existing limb with a knife and retain the limb, leave it to heal over. But that's another one that can continue to spread if not removed. And then on the lower right, we have black knot, which affects our cherries and plums sometimes, and that's another one very easy to spot that, very noticeable, and should just be cut below the point where you see it. Next slide. So ending this section with our pruning don'ts. Actually, I think we have Espalier slides after this, but our pruning don'ts. So if you take one thing from this presentation, is that you should not shear your fruit trees. Every cut you make should be to a specific point of origin for a thinning cut, or a specific bud for a heading cut. Don't leave stub cuts on your trees. Shearing is really for hedges only. So that's a key point. Don't prune in fall if it can be avoided. So like we said, we do most of our pruning in winter. We have some emergency pruning. You really want to, as much as possible, avoid fall pruning. You can cause the tree to put out new growth that then is not ready for the winter cold. So you can really cause additional damage to your tree by fall pruning. And then don't apply anything to wounds. That is an old-fashioned technique that has research has shown is actually counterproductive. Putting anything on the wounds can actually interfere with the plant's own natural ability to heal. So don't apply anything to pruning cuts. And last, really most important, don't be afraid to prune. You got to get out there and do this, and you'll learn by doing. You'll see the effect of your cuts the next season. If you're following the principles we've given you and the basics of how to make a good cut, then you're going to be helping your tree. So don't be afraid to do it. I know a lot of people are really hesitant to cut their tree, feel like they're hurting it, but you're really, when I see a nicely pruned tree, it's a happy tree to me, and it's going to be healthier and more productive with good pruning. So I do have a few Espalier slides, and we don't do a lot of Espalier. They are a little more work, but they are a great option for small spaces. So they can really be good for city sites where you have limited horizontal space. And so an Espalier is basically a tree that you've trained. Actually, you can do this with some berry bushes as well, but training a plant to grow two-dimensionally against a wall or a fence instead of its normal 3 dimensions. And there are many different forms. I will show you a couple of slides of the palmette and the fan shape. There are many different systems from around the world. Lorette, modified Lorette, 3-bud system. What I'm going to try to get across tonight is the principles of Espalier pruning. It sounded like Dan, who's on here, might have more experience with specific systems. But basically what you're going to try to do is keep all your growth perpendicular to the plane of the tree. So you're keeping it 2-dimensional. You're thinning overcrowded branches because you're training it to an unnatural form. It's going to want to shoot up a lot of upright growth that will need removal. You will need to prune multiple times a year. So winter and summer pruning, some systems, it's 2 prunings in summer, sometimes it's 1. I think Dan mentioned he does 3 prunings each summer. And like I said, cutting back a lot of vertical sprouts. So let's look at some of the forms. So this first slide is of a palmette form. This is probably the most common one you'll see. where you have a main trunk up the middle, kind of like a flattened version of the central leader form. So you have a straight up trunk up the middle, and then a series of side branches, in this case, growing straight out. Sometimes they're angled a little upwards. I've also seen them in sort of more of a candelabra shape, where at the ends they curve up and go vertical, where each layer is slightly less long than the one below it, so sort of forms a candelabra. But anyway, this form is most often used for pome fruits, pears, and apples, and can work fairly well for those. You do want to, when you're thinking about doing espalier, get a dwarf tree. Trying to espalier a semi-dwarf or larger tree can be especially challenging. It's not impossible, but much easier with the dwarf tree. Next slide. So our other main form is the fan shape, and this is most often used for stone fruits. We're actually looking at an espalier of a fig tree here, but fan you can think of as kind of a flattened out form of an open center in a way, where you have a short trunk and then a series of side branches coming off of that fans out and again forms a flat shape. And I have seen this used on apples as well. It does have a little more, allow the tree to go a little more vertical in spots, which seems to be helpful. So the other sort of main option, and that, if we have one more, that might be it for espalier. Yeah. So that's, an overview of espalier. Again, it's a little more work, but it can be a great technique for a small space. So we have another break here for questions and answers. Anybody?
So maybe the question from Michaela, do the tree forms discussed, open center, modified central, and central leader, follow for dwarf varieties? Any variations on pruning for dwarf varieties?
That is a good point. So for example, some of these you may have to modify for a true dwarf. For example, the central leader form, where Sharon described 3 different layers of scaffold branches. For a dwarf, you may cut that down to just 2 layers, because they don't even get tall enough to have a 3rd layer. Yeah, otherwise you may also have slightly less of a gap between the layers. I don't see there being really any difference to the open center form for a dwarf, unless you want to have it start slightly lower, but the form is going to really look the same way.
Someone asked,
another. Yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
Someone asked about like the 30% cap, and if like the 3Ds exceed that, is that okay?
Yeah, these rules, all the rules of pruning, you can make exceptions to. If you have dead, diseased wood that you need to prune out to save the tree, then you can definitely go beyond 30%. I would note that already dead wood doesn't count towards your 30% total, because it's not a living part of the tree. So you can remove that and then start your 30%. But definitely, sometimes, we've had pear trees hit bad by fire blight, and we had to cut them almost all the way back and retrain them, removing, way more than 50% of the tree. Let's see. I thought I saw another question. Oh, someone had asked about why some of the trees were listed in multiple forms. So like apples and pears were mentioned for both central leader and modified central leader. And that really depends on the variety. I would say I have never seen a pear tree that isn't very upright that wouldn't do well with central leader, but you can train them to modified. Some apples are more spreading in habit than others, and may be better suited to modified central leader than central leader. But you can look that information up when you're planting your tree. What is the growth habit of this particular variety of apple, and help guide you. But many of the trees can be trained to either, and that's perfectly fine.
Someone asked, like, what time is best to prune peaches?
That's a great question. I'm answering all of these, Corey or Sharon. Do either of you want to take one? I'm happy to do it.
I could talk about peaches. So peaches, there's kind of like some people say wait till later because they're so disease prone, and so to even shorten that gap of when there's an open wound, do it more towards spring so that it shortens that. But we haven't really seen that to be so necessary, and we just do it while we're pruning everything else, because I always say when you have time is the best time, and so we go ahead and do it in the winter along with everything else, and haven't seen too much of a advantage to waiting.
But yeah, if we didn't mention it earlier, our winter pruning season, mid-January through mid-March is ideal. And again, peaches, sometimes we do a little later, but let's see. What should we do if a tree starts to lean? One thing to be aware of especially with dwarf fruit trees, particularly apples, they need support throughout their life. What makes them dwarf is that they're grafted to a very weak root system. That's what keeps them small, but also in many cases makes them unstable. So many dwarf trees in particular will need to be staked throughout their life to stay upright. If a tree's already leaning, you can try to pull it up more upright and tie it to a stake on the side opposite from the lean. Is usually the best approach. Yeah, occasionally when a tree is really gone and we can't get it upright again, we'll cut it and retrain it. Like one of the side branches now becomes the trunk. So that is a possibility. But it ends up with a very funny looking tree, but you can always retrain a tree. Anything else we missed?
Someone asked if you could grow Espalier in pots.
Yeah, it can be done. Again, you'd want to use a dwarf tree. Don't really want to put a larger semi-dwarf or standard tree in a pot. It's going to want to get much larger. But a tree that already wants to be dwarf, you want to put it in as large a pot as possible. And yeah, it can be grown as an espalier in a pot. Generally, trees in pots eventually will need to come out and be root pruned, meaning you cut back the top and also the roots, and then repot it with new soil, because eventually they will exhaust the soil in the container. But you have a number of years before you need to get to that. Let's see. It seems like we have some new questions coming in. Is there a circumstance you'd keep a damaged branch rather than fully pruning it? Yeah, potentially. Certainly a lot of types of damage, unless their disease, can heal over. So depending how bad that damage is, if it's a branch you really want to keep for some reason because there's not another branch that could take its place, or other reason, then possibly you could leave it and have the wound heal over. But it really depends on the specific damage. Resources for staking trees. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. If you need you generally need a heavy duty stake, like a T-post or U-post would work, or a heavy duty wooden stake. And then tree straps are a great thing to actually, hold it to the stake. Maybe we could share. I think the Tree Philly planting guide has some guidance on staking. Anyway, we could find a link to share out with our follow-up email. Well, let's move on. We'll have one more section of question and answer at the end, time permitting, but we're going to move on to berries and brambles next. So In terms of berries and brambles, there are two types of berry bushes, essentially. There's your woody berries, and there are your brambles. Brambles are your blackberries, raspberries, black raspberries. Everything else is a woody berry and is pruned in a different way. But the key thing to understand about brambles is that they have no permanent wood. Each cane or branch growing from the ground only lives for 2 years and then it dies. And where you prune them depends on whether they are summer bearing or an ever bearing blackberry or raspberry. And sort of what is the difference is in an old fashioned summer bearing plant, each cane will start its growth in the spring. In its first year will not fruit at all. It'll overwinter, and then that cane will bear its fruit the following June in the case of raspberries, July in the case of blackberries. And then at that point it will die. So by the fall of that second year, all those second year canes will be dead. With an ever-bearing raspberry or blackberry, that cane will start its growth in the spring, and in the fall it will bear fruit at the tip of its cane. Then that will overwinter and bear fruit again the following June or July. So that's how you get, it's not constantly bearing fruit. It's got 2 seasons of production, and they call it ever bearing. So it's important to know the difference between those two and know what you've planted. So in terms of winter pruning, you're going to remove all those dead second year canes if you haven't already done that, and you'll thin out any smaller new canes, and you'll prune back the remaining canes. And I'll talk about that in the next slides. And blackberries also have some summer pruning, which I'll talk about. So here we're looking at raspberries. You can see the new canes. These are the ones in this photo. It's not always quite this obvious, the difference. They're not always this bright green, the new canes, but if you look closely, you'll see the second year canes are grayer, browner. The wood is more wrinkly. It's fairly easy to tell which are the old canes that need to be removed and which are the first year canes which you want to keep. In addition to cutting all those old canes to the ground, you will remove any particularly thin canes. The thicker canes are the healthier and will be bearing you more fruit. So thinning it out, get a little more airflow and concentrate the energy on those healthy, thicker canes. And then show on the right side here, we're showing what you do with your ever-bearing canes, which here you can see bore fruit in the fall of the previous year. They will not bear fruit at that same point again. So you cut them just below where those signs of last year's fruiting was. There is another approach to ever-bearing raspberries or blackberries, which is to just cut all of the canes to the ground in the winter. And what happens with that is you don't get your summer crop. You'll just get the fall crop, but it'll be a larger crop in the fall. So this is often done with some commercial raspberries where they want to focus their fruiting on a particular season. And it does apparently have some benefits in terms of disease control as well. But that is another possible technique for ever-bearing plants. We generally like to keep both seasons for our small urban spaces. So looking at blackberries, same thing. You'll go through in the winter and prune out any dead second year canes that you didn't already remove. In raspberries, it's usually very obvious like that. New canes will be bright green or bright red, and the old canes will be brown. Next slide. So blackberries are slightly different from raspberries in how we prune them. So in the summer, once the new canes get 3 or 4 feet high, we'll pinch off the tips, and that encourages some more side branching and more fruiting the next year. In the winter, like I said, we'll cut out all the second year canes. We'll thin out any thin canes, and we will also prune back anything that's over 7 feet tall. Blackberries can get quite tall. And we will also prune back all the side shoots to about 15 inches off the main stem. So here you can see that process. In the end, you have a few, again, thicker, nice, healthy canes with all of their side shoots cut back. And that's the optimal pruning for best fruit production. So the other primary type of berry bush are your woodies, and pretty much anything that's not a bramble would fit in this categories: blueberries, currants, gooseberries, elderberries, aronia, bush cherries, goomies, gojies, honeyberries, anything else. You can really take the same approach, and that is, and each of them does have its own sort of specifics. But again, our goal here tonight is to teach you the principles which you can apply to all of these. And if you prune them this way, this will work for all of the above woody berry bushes. So our approach for these plants is, as usual, remove any dead and diseased wood. But really the key here is removing 25% of the oldest growth of the bush each year. Once it gets to about 4 years old, you can start this process, starting to remove some of the older wood, and that helps to renew the vigor and improve production. So basically, if you left the wood gradually over time, it would get less productive, fewer fruit, smaller fruit, etc. You can, by removing some of the oldest wood each year, it'll send up new growth that's healthier and more productive. You can also thin out overcrowded growth. We aren't quite as detailed about our pruning of berry bushes as we get about our common fruit trees, but that is helpful as well to think about the areas of the plant that are overcrowded and do some thinning out. Next slide. So here we've got a couple images of before and after pruning. So we've cut some of our branches all the way back to 1 or 2 inches above the ground. Again, you pick the oldest, gnarliest looking branch and cut it all the way back. We've also thinned out some spots where it was a little overcrowded. We've pruned out some of the growth at the base of the plant that's kind of trailing along the ground. Nice to keep a little airspace underneath. So pretty simple process. It doesn't take long to prune your berry bushes. Next slide. Yeah, so this is just showing before and after of pruning. Here we've taken out again some of the oldest wood, thinning out branches that kind of trail along the ground. You see it before and after. It's really just a few cuts you're making. Snip, snip with your loppers, and your berry bushes are done. Next slide. So I'm going to move on to fruiting vines. And again, my goal here is to teach you the principles of woody vine pruning. Our main woody fruiting vines in this climate are grapes and hardy kiwis. We also plant some other things like maypops and hops, but those are herbaceous vines. They die back to the ground in the winter. There's no pruning necessary. They just regrow from the ground. And yeah, grapes and kiwis are both often in a commercial setting pruned to very specific forms and techniques. But again, I'm going to get across to you the basic principles. And that the things to understand about vines is that they store all of their energy in their root system over the winter, and they fruit on new growth. So unlike your fruit trees and your berry bushes, which mostly form their fruiting buds the previous year, those buds overwinter and then they flower in the spring. Vines do not overwinter any fruiting buds. All their fruiting buds are formed on brand new growth coming off the vine. So that makes it very different, their approach to pruning, than fruit trees. As always, we'll prune out any dead or diseased growth. But because of this fact of them storing energy in their roots and fruiting on new growth, we're actually going to prune out 90% of the woody growth each season on our woody vines. And because we're removing the majority of the growth, it's actually easier to start off by identifying what you want to keep and then pruning the rest off. So we want to retain healthy, newer, thicker growth in general. We want to train to a single trunk wherever possible. And of course, we need to train to a structure. Vines are not freestanding. That's what makes them a vine. And there are, again, specific growing systems. I'll give you a little bit of detail on that. Next slide. So again, you can train a woody vines to an overhead arbor or pergola. Next slide. Or you can train them to a set of wires. So this is the way most grapes in the world are grown, on a 2-wire system. Most of your vineyards are going to look like this, where you have a short main trunk And then the growth is trained along 2 wires going either direction. First one being about 3 feet high and the second being about 5.5 feet off the ground. So you've got a gap of a couple feet in between them for good airflow. So what we're looking at here, and I guess you can't see my pointer, but we've got a permanent main trunk. So what we're seeing here, I'll say this is after pruning is completed, what it's going to look like. And this is like a very specific vineyard form for a grape. You're going to cut off any suckers. So that's just showing what a sucker is and that it should be removed. Then on each direction on these wires, there's going to be 2 things. There's going to be well, 3 things really. A small permanent arm, just short little stub coming off the main trunk. And off of that arm are going to be 2 things. There's going to be the long cane or fruiting branch of the grape. And there's also going to be a small renewal spur of just a couple buds coming off. And so this cane or fruiting arm is where almost all your fruit production is going to be the next year. In a like European wine grape, you're going to cut that back to just about 10 buds on the whole thing. And then you leave a couple buds in the renewal spur. So the whole plant will have less than 50 buds. So again, you're removing 90% of the growth from the previous year. So the thing to understand about the renewal spur and the fruiting cane is that they switch each year. So again, you want to keep these plants young. So that fruiting cane will have all the fruit this year. And then next winter, you'll cut it back severely to just a couple buds. And the growth from that renewal spur is what you will leave to be the fruiting cane the following year. So they'll kind of switch back and forth to again keep the grapevine young and as productive as possible. So again, on this European wine grape, total of less than 50 buds left on the whole thing. For some of your American cultivars that are a little more robust, you might leave 15 or so buds per fruiting arm. So they'll have a bit more. But that's a very specific system. Here you can see showing your, this is actually kind of not a perfect illustration, but permanent arm, and then a renewal spur here with some growth coming off of that. And you'll see those flowers forming on that brand new growth, first year growth. Next slide. So Kiwiberries in a commercial setting are most often trained to a T trellis formation. So a post and then a cross piece and then a set of wires in between them, usually 4 or 5 wires. This is the whole side arm is about 5 feet wide. The post generally 5 to 6 feet, although we've done them higher, so it makes it easier to walk underneath. And this on a kiwi vine is going to have a permanent trunk going up to the wires, and then a permanent cordon or side arm coming off of that. And then coming off of the permanent cordon are a series of fruiting arms that you'll cut and space to about 1 feet apart in each direction. And off of those fruiting arms, you'll see the fruit forms. So here on the right, you can see that T trellis formation in commercial orchard. We actually do have some commercial kiwiberry farms in Pennsylvania. And on the left, just to point out, we have grown kiwiberries and grapes on chain link fences with somewhat limited pruning and not to these forms, and they've still fruited pretty well, especially kiwiberries. Grapes are much more, excuse me, susceptible to pest and disease, so are better to a more one of these more concrete forms. Kiwiberries are pretty resilient, robust plants that can fruit pretty well with minimal pruning. Next slide. So that wraps up our slideshow, but we have, I think, a little bit of time for more question and answer.
Couple questions in the chat, Phil. One about dwarf trees and Madeline's questions about over pruning.
Okay, I'm gonna look through here. What about over pruning? Sorry, trying to find these questions. What do you do if you've over pruned, or are there any problems associated with it? Basically, if you exceed that 30% number, you're going to get a lot of quick upright growth will respond, which can be challenging, but is not the end of the world. You can always retrain a tree. You may want to think about doing some of that early summer, late spring pruning to remove some of the quick upright growth. Otherwise, you'll get yourself in a pattern of every year that tree shooting up a lot of that unwanted quick upright growth. But I know orchardists who have come across a neglected tree and basically cut the whole thing to 2 feet above the ground and let it resprout and retrained it back to a good form. So you can always retrain a tree. It's not the end of the world if for some reason you had to prune something severely. What was the other question? I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through here.
Owen had asked about genetic dwarf fruit trees.
Yeah, so the basic thing to understand is that their varieties aren't dwarf. It is the rootstocks that are dwarf. So grafting, and this is mainly true of apples. There are some dwarfing stocks for other fruit trees, but it's really with apples that you see dramatic differences in size. So you can have my favorite apple, Gold Rush apple, planted on a dwarf rootstock and it will only get 8 feet tall. Or you could have it growing on its own roots or on a standard rootstock and it would get 25 feet tall. So it really is just what the rootstock it is grafted to. And you can look that up when you purchase a tree, what the rootstock is. But as I said a little earlier, what keeps a tree dwarf is that it's attached to a weaker, smaller set of roots. And we, for organic growing, generally recommend larger semi-dwarf or larger rootstock for best health and production. They're more robust trees and tend to have a bit fewer challenges with pest and disease. But if you're in a small urban space, you don't have room for a 15-foot tree, then absolutely you should be planting a dwarf. You don't want to fight a tree that wants to be bigger to keep it at 8 feet. Hopefully that's helpful. There are some super dwarfs for peaches as well. You may have seen patio peaches that are basically like little shrub peaches. And then you can pay attention to other things. Some of your stone fruits are commonly sold on semi-dwarf stock, but you rarely see full dwarfs for stone fruits. Any other questions?
Couple more in the chat. If letting a kiwi grow on a fence. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
Does pruning affect the root system at all? Not a great deal. So if we do winter pruning, again, the root system is where most of the energy is over the winter, and anything you prune off a tree is essentially going to regrow in the next season. There may be some small dieback of roots happening in conjunction with your pruning at the top, but it doesn't have a great effect on the roots, especially winter pruning. Anybody want to address the mulching question?
Or the kiwis growing on a fence? How to prune those?
Yeah. As I said, we've had situations where they really weren't pruned on a fence, and they still fruited well. But the main thing I would keep in mind is that pruning them is actually good for their fruit production. So if you can do some cutting back to encourage more new growth, you may get more fruit. You also want to pay attention to where they start to twine around themselves. They can actually choke off their own growth that way. So always pruning out anything that's twined around itself. is a really basic thing. One approach I've thought about for fences, if it's a somewhat low fence, is training up a single trunk, and then you could create a permanent cordon or side arm going either direction at the top of the fence and leave fruiting arms. So you could really adopt that traditional system, but just on a chain link fence. So that's something you could try. But again, like I said, kiwis have done fairly well with minimal pruning. And the other question was a donut around the trunk. Yeah, just to be clear, when you're adding compost or mulch around a tree, you always want to keep it away from the trunk itself, at least 3 inches off the trunk. When we're first planting a tree, we'll often make sort of a donut, either with soil or mulch, 3 feet wide around the tree to help retain water when we're watering the tree. But it isn't necessary to do that for an established tree. But in general, fruit trees don't like competition with grass, so it is good to keep an area either mulched or otherwise cleared of vegetation right around the base of the tree. Let's see. Any other questions we missed?
And we did just put a link in the chat. We'd love for you to fill out our workshop evaluation form if you can. It's not that many questions. Helps us know what we can improve for next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Like
Like I said, we also encourage you to sign up for upcoming workshops. We have 3 more in this series. Hope to see you next week.
Bye.